Hey, what's up, nerds? PaulMConti here. I wanted to do a little bit of a tournament recap from this past weekend. I know it's almost a week later now. And just kind of give you some general thoughts on playing Nurgle so far, and what my experience has been like, what my thoughts are on the army in general, just from what I've done so far. So it was just a local event. I believe it was 12 people total, 3 rounds, 2,000 points. I ran a Blight Cyst list. So it was 3 units of Blight Kings, 2 units of 5, and 1 unit of 10. Lord of Blights, Lord of Afflictions with a Rustfang, Gutrot Spume to Deep Strike, some Blight Kings, Great Unclean one with Bell and Bileblade, as well as the Whitherstave to make your opponent reroll their 6s to hit. And he had favored Poxes for his spell. And I feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh, there were 10 Plaguebearers in there. And I think that was it. So, really liked the list. For those not totally familiar, basically, the big thing that Blight Cyst does is it gives all of your putrid Blight Kings rend on all of their attacks, which is bizonkers good. I don't know, for people that have not tried this yet and have not experienced this yet, Blight Kings with rend with the other armor debuffs that Nurgle can throw around, it's really awesome to have that much power coming out of your Blight Kings. So tournament recap in general. Round 1 was Duality of Death. So 2 objectives on the board that have to be held by heroes. I was playing against an Ironjawz opponent. I got initiative for turn 1 and went first. I had deployed so that I was able to get my Lord of Afflictions up onto the objective on turn 1. I was hoping for basically lucky rolls on the other side of the board to get my Great Unclean one into place on the other objective. He failed his run roll. He also failed his casting on moving the wheel to +2 movement. So he just didn't get to the objective. I had deployed Gutrot Spume in ambush with the unit of 10 Blight Kings, and they successfully came on to the board first turn. They made a successful charge into a unit of 10 brutes, and I had some of the worst rolls of my life, and they basically whiffed on the brutes. I think they killed like 1 or 2 of them, and they, over the course of, I think, like 3 rounds of combat, like all 10 of them got wiped. So basically, at the end of my turn 1, I had one of the objectives. I wasn't able to get anything up even to really defend the other objective or prevent my opponent from getting there. My Great Unclean one didn't quite make it up. My big unit of Blight Kings had basically whiffed and were already on the ropes against brutes. Like, brutes are really good. They're really strong. A unit of 10 of them is really painful to deal with. And that attack failing was just really bad. So on my opponent's turn, he doesn't really challenge my objectives on turn 1, but he advances his force up pretty considerably. Does a lot more damage to my Blight Kings. The big key thing is that after this, he wins the initiative roll on turn 2 and double turns me, and then locks down my Great Unclean one with 2 units of pigs, and I just didn't have enough firepower on that side of the board to deal with 2 units of pigs that are on my Great Unclean one. I had 1 unit of Blight Kings that was moving towards the other objective to help defend my Lord of Afflictions, and I had my Harbinger of Decay heading off in that general direction as well. I think that's what I missed in my list recap, is Harbinger of Decay was my general. So that was headed off towards one objective. So I had a unit of 5 Blight Kings to deal with 6 pigs, and then my unit of 10 Blight Kings that were getting smashed by a unit of 10 brutes. Thankfully, it tied up the unit of 10 brutes, but it really put a serious hurt on that general situation. So still at the end of his turn 2, top of turn 2, he didn't have anything on objectives yet, but he had cleared my Lord of Afflictions off of the objective, and he had my Great Unclean one really well pinned down on the objective, like away from the second objective. My turn 2, I move up my Harbinger of Decay to grab that second objective. My Great Unclean one, with the buff loadout, he just hits like a wet paper bag. He's great for a lot of other things. He makes stuff move fast. He lets you cast spells better. He's very survivable. Like, he was taking a pounding from those pigs, and he went nowhere. He survived the entire game. But he was just not doing any damage. I think in that game, the Nurglings did more than his Bell or his Bileblade did in combat. So basically the upshot of the story for that game is the majority of the game, my Great Unclean one was tied up and wasn't able to get to the objective. I eventually cleared off enough stuff to get a path to retreat out of the combat with the pigs and get onto the objective with barely more than 3 inches of space around him to not be in combat with anything else, and sit on that for a couple of turns. My Harbinger of Decay didn't last very long on the other side because it just got eaten by a Maw Crusher very quickly, which then proceeded to just sit on that objective. And with what I had left, a Maw Crusher was not coming off the board with, like, a couple of miscellaneous heroes and a couple of Blight Kings that were left. That, I had 5 Blight Kings that were facing down a unit of, I think, 20 Ardboys, something like that. And I think they basically fought to a draw. The game ended up being really close points wise. I lost by 1 victory point. So it was a really good tight game. It felt a lot more one-sided on the board than the score reflected. I think my opponent might not have been playing to the objectives as much as maybe he should have been. But, in the end, he ended up, getting the major victory on it. Game 2 was Knife to the Heart. That's a diagonal deployment. And with just 2 objectives on the board and hold both at the end of turn 3, and you win the game. And this was against a Tzeentch opponent. So very interesting game. Was not running really a typical list of like what you see in a lot of really competitive Tzeentch armies, but was still playing with a lot of the standard Tzeentch tricks. Lord of Change, a dude on a Balewind. Gaunt Summoner. That's the guy. Gaunt Summoner on a Balewind. Bunch of pink horrors with spells that do mortal wounds. But he wasn't running Change Host, and he wasn't running any other battalions. He was basically just kind of running that, some miscellaneous stuff. A unit of 6 Skyfires and a unit of 15 Chaos Warriors marked Tzeentch. So he basically just castled up in the corner, and with his Chaos Warriors in front and his Lord of Change and Gaunt Summoner behind them to just defend the objective. I got top of turn 1 again, and I went for the deep strike with 10 Blight Kings, and I went straight after his Skyfires. Managed to kill, made the charge, killed off half the unit of Skyfires immediately, which was really good. I was really pumped about that. The rest of my force, I basically was just like, I'm just going to push up the center. And I left my Plaguebearers back to hold my objective. And I was basically just like praying they would just hold out, and that he wouldn't get overly aggressive on them. In general, the plan kind of worked. What happened on top of his turn is he managed to get the spell off to boost his or to bring the models back in his Skyfire unit. So they went back to their full strength of 6 and immediately retreated out of combat like 16 inches plus a run. So they were way far away from anything that I had, and they were headed straight for my objective, along with the Zangor Shaman that was buffing them up. So they weren't able to do any shooting in that turn, but they kind of mucked up the plan a little bit. Thankfully, the ward save off of the Harbinger of Decay really shrugged a lot of mortal wounds off from spells, because other than the stuff that I had, the unit of 10 Blight Kings that came up the side, everything else was basically in a cluster coming up the middle of the board. So really everything was under that protection of the Harbinger of Decay, and then the Great Unclean one has his own ward save, and the Plaguebearers have their own ward save. So I had a lot of mortal wound protection, which was really useful against Tzeentch. So I was really resilient against that. I was able to use the Great Unclean One spell to do some healing on my Blight Kings as well. That was really useful. I basically just charged up the middle and went straight after his unit of Chaos Warriors, and just the goal was to just beat my way through to the objective. And his Skyfires made pretty quick work of my Plaguebearers, but he realized he had made a miscalculation when he was setting up his castle in the corner, and he had not he hadn't bubbled his Chaos Warriors out far enough to prevent me from getting up into combat and being close enough to oppose his objective to stop him from winning game immediately. So it basically became a war of attrition, right? Can I get enough damage through to just kill all of his stuff? And I came very close to tabling him over the course of this game. To basically make a long story short, I think all that was left at the end of The fifth battle round was his most of his unit of Skyfires and the Zangor Shaman. I killed everything else. And the dude on the Balewind was still hanging out, but he wasn't really, he was just being a dude on a Balewind, and other than like shooting him with spells or with throwing the rotting heads at him from the Lord of Blights, I didn't really have anything that I could do about that. But he wasn't really a great threat of any kind, and he wasn't, actually scoring that objective anyway. So ended up with a minor victory on points. Points killed because I had taken down so much of his force. And I still had my Great Unclean one alive. I still had my unit of 10 Blight Kings was still alive. I still had a couple of heroes alive. So I still had a big block of the points in my list were still on the board. So I got a minor victory for that one, which was really good. Last game was Starstrike, and it was up against Khorne, and it was basically just a Bloodbound list. And it was a very interesting game, and I think the thing that really broke my way in this game was the setup of the table. It was set up in such a way that my opponent's side of the table was basically like a village. So he had a bunch of buildings in the way that were creating very small channels for him to get his units through. And they weren't wide enough for him to get his units of Skull Crushers through, going 3 wide, because he was running Gore Pilgrims and Brass Stampede was basic concept of the list. So his Juggernauts basically had to go onto the flanks, and his infantry had to kind of come up through the middle in kind of like in files. He wasn't able to get a lot of frontage across. And where I had placed my Feculent Gnarlmaw also, it blocked up one of the wider channels to basically turn it into 2 smaller channels again. So it basically gave me a really big advantage in that particular game, that I was able to advance up far enough on, in the first couple of turns, that I was able to really meet his charge. He was stuck in very narrow places. His advantage was, in general, having greater numbers and to get his attacks in, but he couldn't get those attacks in because there wasn't enough frontage against my Blight Kings. So my Blight Kings were wide enough that, units 5 wide are going to just completely clog that hole. And I'm getting my max attacks in, and he was getting a very small number of attacks back. So it was an interesting kind of like defensive game. From that perspective, it was really like plug the holes, stop him from coming through. And I got a couple of really, lucky die rolls in my favor. I had a unit of 5 Blight Kings charge a full strength unit of Mighty Skull Crushers and spike them in 1 round of combat. Like 15 wounds through that were not saved off the board in 1 round of combat, which was really cool. Just emphasizing Blight Cyst is a really, really good battalion. And I encourage people to go use it. And my unit of Plaguebearers, they were really just there to plug a hole. and man, did they plug a hole well. They made lots and lots of saves, and on 2 separate occasions, they rolled a 1 for Battle Shock and then rolled high on their roll to restore models and restored the unit back up to full again. Twice that happened. Like, that's very unusual lucky rolling. And then just where the stars fell, where the 3 objective markers fell on the board, was just really favorable to me. The one in the center fell directly in the middle of the board, which I had a lot of, like, the mass of my troops were really in the middle. So I really had good board control in the center. The star on my side of the board was also in the center. So I could just sit back with 1 hero and hold on to that objective, and the mass of my troops were up in the front and preventing things from coming through. And then the star on my opponent's side of the board landed on the flank where I had a unit of Blight Kings just wipe that unit of Juggernauts, and there was really nothing else off on that flank. So the Blight Kings just waltzed up onto the objective and held on to it for the rest of the game. So it was basically a very tactical advantage that I had that really, I think, gave me a big advantage in that game. I think if it had been, a different setup on the board, it could have gone a lot differently. But just the way things fell, I ended up getting, virtually all of the scenario points for that match. Just basically a big piece of it was the luck of where the stars dropped. Getting some lucky rolls in a couple of other places that just were all of the stars aligned for Star Strike. And it just went really, really well for me. So I finished 3rd overall for the tournament. I was actually 1 tiebreaker point away from 2nd. So I was really happy with the finish overall. Really happy with the way the army performed. I've been really liking Nurgle in general. I really like Blight Cyst a lot for an offensive version of Nurgle. I've been toying around with Plague Touched Warband as well, and using the Blight Kings as the hammers for that force. The interesting thing with Blight Kings is that they're hammers and anvils at the same time. They take a lot of damage. They're 21 wounds for 160 points on 5 bodies. That's just a tremendous amount, for your opponent to dig into. And, if you're running it in a Plague Touched Warband, everything is -1 to hit them in close combat. If you're running Harbinger of Decay as your general, they also have a 5-up ward save. That was unbelievably powerful, that combination of things. Just to have them be really powerful on offense as well as on defense. The Plaguebearers they're Plaguebearers. They basically did their job in all of the games. They just kind of got in the way or held an objective. I think there's probably a better use for those points. I had some extra slack in the list. I think I've got an extra 20 points in the list. And so if I take out the Plaguebearers, it's 140. So that's pick a Nurgle hero. Or potentially shading something off a hero somewhere else, making a swap, and running another unit of Blight Kings, or a variety of things. there's a variety of thoughts that are in there. Possibly turning that great unclean one into a Glotkin. That's a possibility. I don't currently own a Glotkin, and he's been something I've been thinking about. The Great Unclean one has been an all-star in general, and I am very reluctant to give up that big bubble of +3 movement that he gives, and having all of your spells at +1 all the time. A lot of Nurgle spells go off on 7s, and that is really tough. When all of your spells are going off on 6 instead, then it happens pretty regularly. So you're able to put the wheel on what you want when you want it very frequently. That said, you could do something similar with a Poxbringer with the Tome, Tome of 1,000 Poxes, I think it is, and just swap that out for the Whitherstave. So you still have a caster that's at +1 that gives you that that kind of regularity for the spells that you need when you need them. The problem is his regular spell sucks, so you're really just using him for whatever spell you grab out of the lore of Nurgle and the spell that lets you move the wheel. So I'm not really sure what I'm doing there. In general, I feel like the Great Unclean one really does his job. He gets in the way. He absorbs a lot of wounds. He tends to not die. He tends to be a really big distraction. He casts spells when you need them, and he carries an artifact that debuffs your opponent, which is very useful. The movement buff is huge because the big problem with Nurgle is all of your stuff is movement 4 for the most part, and he makes everything movement 7, and then he can, with the Bileblade, easily move the wheel to +2 movement. So now all of your Blight Kings are movement 9. And if they're moving near a Feculent Gnarlmaw, now they can run and charge. So there's definitely some very quick movement that you can do. Some other things that I've been kind of thinking about as well. I feel like the Puscoil Blight Lords are really underrated. I haven't personally actually used them or seen them in combat yet. But I feel like looking at their profile and generally what they do, and some overlap of what other things in the game do, I feel like there's more there than people are really giving them credit for. Offensively, they just seem like they're outshined by Blight Kings, but they're more mobile, and they have a lot of other abilities going on with them as well. And, the high level of durability, if you're running a Harbinger of Decay as your general, that's huge. They're like 4 up, 5 up, 5 up at that point, which is they're not going to take a lot of wounds. Excuse me. So that's something interesting to try. I think that would have to be in a Plague Touch warband. I'm not really sure what that list would actually look like, or how many of them I would run, but I think they're a definite possibility. I definitely really like using Gutrot Spume. He is extremely useful to really just have some shock troops go in on your opponent's end of the board. And the way he's worded, it lets you choose which unit of Blight Kings is going to set up an ambush with him. And it's also a May ability, so you can choose to not use it if you want to. So you have the ability to not do it at all, or in a list like the one that I ran, you can choose to either set up an ambush with a unit of 5 Blight Kings or a unit of 10 Blight Kings. So that kind of flexibility, I think, is really useful. He's also pretty good in combat. So that's definitely something to consider as well. Like, he's a pretty survivable, heavy-hitting combat hero on his own. You know, not terribly exciting, but he's throwing around a decent amount of damage so that it's, you know, like, he's not just 140 points to throw your guys in off the side of the board. Sorry, need some water to not cough and hack through everything. So yeah, I mean, so far I've really liked Nurgle a lot. It's a very interesting, flexible, tactical army. The low model count with Blight Kings is really interesting. It's a very, very elite army that seems one-dimensional, but kind of isn't. The the Blight Cyst also gives your dudes shooting attack, which is it's not doing a ton of damage, but it's, you know, it's one of those things that Nurgle generally just doesn't do on its own anyway. So having some 14-inch shooting attacks coming off your guys, I mean, even if they're like on 4 up, 3 up, like, who cares? Like, it's still, you're still shooting something, and you weren't before. So it can be useful to, you know, get in combat and hit that thing that's behind the lines and get a couple of wounds on it. And maybe your great Unclean one gets off some spells to do some damage to something. Maybe you can pick off a hero that's hanging out in the back. I have also, you know, in some practice games, run more heavy demon list using lots of Plaguebearers. And I definitely have some concerns about the viability of a Plaguebearer heavy list. And really the big problem is that they just don't hit hard. They're base 1 attack, so you really need to run either Glotkin or a Great Unclean one as your general to give them any offensive power at all. So that they get extra attacks. The list design, I think you really need to run, like, they're very, very, very effective anvils running a Taliban. You know, running like 2 blocks of 30 Plaguebearers is, I mean, it's really good. And in the Taliban, they're like restoring models for free every turn, and that's really good. -1 to hit in close combat, 5 up save, -2 to hit in shooting, which is really good. But I mean, they're slow. They're, again, a 4-inch mover, and if you're not in the bubble of the Great Unclean one, which, I mean, you can snake your guys out effectively to stay within that bubble. But God forbid you end up not in that bubble. You have giant blobs of Plaguebearers that are not moving quickly, and that's a problem. And that general list has a problem with just not really having hammers and not having the points room to put hammers in. I think plague drones are probably your best bet, but they're still just not getting quite enough oomph, I don't think. So yeah, I feel like the demon build is still like a maybe. I want it to work. I like the idea. You know, having a giant pillow for your opponent to hit is a pretty cool idea for an army, but it really needs some hammers or it's not going to get anywhere. Simply not dying is not enough in Age of Sigmar right now to really get you victories. And it's really frustrating for your guys to sit there and not die and then not do any damage back. That sucks. Not having really anything to hit your opponent back with is majorly painful. So yeah, I guess just to overall recap, I threw my list from the tournament in the show notes. If anybody wants to check that out, it worked really well. I recommend it. I think I'm probably going to make some tweaks in the future, but that I think is a pretty good core list, a good basis to work off of to to build out something. Tweak things here and there for the future. Yeah, so having fun with Nurgle. I dig it. Got some other things to try. Might be buying a Glotkin. Still working on painting. These guys are taking forever because Blight Kings have a lot of detail. They're like little heroes, each and every one of them. So I want to give them the appropriate amount of love and respect that they deserve. So yeah, that is all I got for now, guys. Just kind of a general Nurgle update, little tournament recap. Feel free to drop anything in the comments that you'd like. The like button and the subscribe button are always greatly appreciated. Leaving comments, always appreciated. And even you dirty bastards that hit the dislike button, I will have you know that it actually does not do anything. It actually, if anything, is a slight positive because it still shows additional viewer interaction with your videos and is, despite it appearing to be a negative in YouTube's analytics and their algorithms, it actually boosts up your video more because there's audience interaction, even though it's negative. So yeah, fuck you guys. Anywho, that's it. I'll talk to y'all later. See ya.